Okay, so thanks everybody for having me and for coming out. My name's Dr. Kerry Kriger. I'm the founder and executive director of Save the Frogs. I'm going to be talking for about an hour about give you some natural history facts about frogs and other amphibians, tell you what's happening to frogs, some of the threats they face in California and around the world, why they're important and worth saving, some easy ways that all of you can help out, and then talk to you for a little bit about what I'm doing with Save the Frogs to protect amphibian populations around the world. So if you have any pressing questions, you can feel free to raise your hand and ask. Otherwise, we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So frogs are the most well-known amphibians, but there's actually 5 different types of amphibians. Here's a Pacific chorus frog. It's the most common frog in coastal Pacific United States and up through Vancouver, British Columbia. So if you hear loud frogs calling at night, probably Pacific chorus frog because they're fairly abundant. Then there's the toads. Frogs and toads are quite similar. One of the big differences, toads have this big parotoid gland packed full of toxins that protect them because they're pretty slow moving. Toads generally don't hop like frogs. They kind of run along slowly. So all those poisons keep them safe because lots of animals like to eat amphibians. Also, toads tend to have short legs, but generally speaking, frogs and toads are essentially the same. This is a cane toad. I took this picture in Guyana in South America. They're native to Central and South America, but they cause lots of problems elsewhere. In the 1930s, they got spread throughout the world because farmers thought that they would eat the pests that damaged the sugar cane. And one really bad place is in Australia. 104 cane toads got taken to Australia in 1935, and cane toad females can lay about 20,000 eggs. And the Australian predators are not used to any kind of poisonous frogs. In Australia, it's all non-poisonous frogs, so nothing's really able to eat all those poisons. So the cane toads have proliferated, and now there's hundreds of millions of them marching across Australia, causing lots of problems. So the frogs and toads, and then salamanders and newts. Salamanders and newts have tails. Here's an arboreal salamander. I took this picture at Mount Madonna, south of San Jose, a couple months ago when it started raining. California slender salamander, also at Mount Madonna. He's curled up in a defensive posture. Yellow-eyed ensatina. So these guys are pretty common in the Santa Cruz Mountains. If you go out and it's moist and you roll over some logs, there's probably a salamander hanging out under there, and especially the yellow-eyed ensatinas. Cow-knob salamander. I grew up in Virginia. Save the Frogs was actually based in Virginia until a year ago when I moved out to Santa Cruz. So this guy's from West Virginia. Red-spotted newt from the Shenandoah Mountains. Newts have toxins on their skin, so they're kind of like the toads. So slow moving, like to protect themselves. These guys especially move really slowly. Have y'all seen the California newts? Really common, very toxic. If you eat one of them, it happens to crawl in your coffee pot like it did to someone 10 years ago, and you drink the coffee, then you'll probably die like that guy did. So watch out. Caecilians are the least known of the amphibians. They live underground, and they don't live in United States, so most people don't know anything about them. They're from Central and South America, Africa, Southeast Asia. No arms, no legs, no tail, and then a lot of them don't even have eyes, or they have very reduced eyes because they're living underground and just don't need them. And they can get very large like that. They're often confused. People think they're snakes. In Africa, there's a big problem because farmers think it's a snake and chop them up.
How large is this?
I did not take this picture. I took most of these photos, but not this one. So I'm not sure how long he is, but probably a foot or more.
Okay.
Yeah, I've only seen one once. So.
What'd you call him?
He's a Caecilian.
Cecilian?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So rainforest dragons and other reptiles are really cool, but they're not amphibians. Their reptiles are often confused or lumped together with amphibians, but there's some big differences. One is the scales. Birds and reptiles have scales. Amphibians have more or less smooth skin. Another big difference, reptiles have a hard-shelled eggs. Hard-shelled eggs, like birds, as opposed to the amphibians, have jelly-like eggs that can't survive desiccation. They can't dry out, so that's really important aspect of the natural history of amphibians is that they generally are found near water, and they become most active when it's moist because their eggs cannot dry out. Amphibian actually means that it has two lives, one on land and one in water. So these are foothill yellow-legged frog eggs. Saw these in the Sunol Wilderness near Fremont, and the mother puts the eggs in the creek bottom and glues the eggs to the rocks because when the storms come, otherwise they'd wash away and die. Same stream had California red-legged frog eggs. And then they will eventually, for a lot of frog and toad species, not all of them, but a lot of them have a tadpole larval stage, whereas reptiles don't. Tadpoles have gills, usually eating algae, but some of them are actually cannibalistic. If they're in a small puddle and it starts to dry up and they have to get out and need energy, they'll start eating each other sometimes. So amphibians are really interesting because they have a thin, permeable skin, and they can, to some extent, drink and breathe through their skin. They can uptake oxygen and water right through their skin. So there's a lot of, there's frog and salamander species that actually, even as adults, don't have lungs. They're lungless and get everything, water and oxygen, right through their skin. Perlingbrook Falls, I spent a lot of time at. It's one of my favorite places. I spent 4 years in Australia doing my PhD research on an amphibian disease called chytridiomycosis that I'll be talking about later. And I'd go out sampling frogs. I'd have to catch the frog to run a cotton swab over their skin to pick up a DNA sample. Then I'd let the frogs go. In Perlingbrook Falls, there's about 10 different amphibian species up above it and below it. So they'd all be calling, and you have to get good at knowing what's calling if you want to find them. And then some of them, small and green, usually up on the leaves, they're camouflaged, and they like to shut up when you get close. So they're really hard to find unless you go, and then they'll go, and you can move closer. So that was one of my main frogs for my PhD, so I got really good at calling them. When you're getting your degree, depends on how well you can make a frog call. You figure it out. That's good. That one actually sounds like emerald spotted tree frog. Their closest relative is the northern laughing tree frog. So these guys go northern laughing tree frog, more like You get to notice the slight differences. And they got nice spots. This is actually female, so she wouldn't be calling. It's only the male frogs that call. They're calling to defend their territory and find a mate. And so this is a female. They've got really nice eyes, emerald spots, cool yellow in there. Southern orange-eyed tree frog is my favorite frog. They'd come out when it pours rain and just live in the rainforest, usually up on the sides of waterfalls, right on the cliff's edge. So I always thought they had the nicest place to live. And they're really photogenic. They don't really have any kind of anti-predator response, so you can just get right up to them and they're going. scarlet-sided bobblebonk, they get their name because they go bonk, bonk. So there's the vocal sac. You can see him calling. They fill it up with air, create pressure so that they can go. And the eastern sedge frogs are one of the most common frogs in eastern Australia in suburban areas. They do really well in human habitation. So even if it's a disturbed area, they'll still be out in the ponds going. Great barred frog. You can see the barbs on his legs. There's 5 different species of barred frogs. And you can tell them apart in part because of their eyes. These guys have just a black eye. I'll show you some other barred frog eyes later. He's actually got a mosquito on him. And they go, ark, ark. And they're the one species of barred frog that is not endangered. So 4 out of the 5 species are endangered. Striped marsh frog. They've got a stripe, live in the marsh. They're frogs. They become striped marsh frogs. And they go. So when a lot of them are out calling, it sounds like. Marsupial frog. So they're not marsupials, but the males have a little pouch here. The male, full grown, is the size of my thumbnail, so it's a really small frog. They live up high in the mountains. They're called terrestrial breeders. Throughout the tropics, there's a lot of species that bypass the aquatic tadpole stage. So they depend on moist leaf litter, and the female lays her eggs in the moist leaf litter, and then straight out of the egg emerges a baby froglet, which is obviously really small because the father's the size of my thumbnail. 15 little froglets will crawl into each pouch and hang out for about a month, safe from predators.
Wow.
Oh yeah, they go. Green tree frogs are a neat frog because they can live until they're about 28 years old.
Wow.
Certain frog species are very long-lived. There's a couple in New Zealand that live 30, 35 years. Some species only live 3-4 years. American bullfrogs, they'll have tadpoles that can stay in the water for several years before metamorphosing. So here's a frog I found in Papua New Guinea, and he's really happy because he's got a nice meal of insect eggs. And frogs are called gape-limited predators. That means they'll eat anything that fits in their mouth. They can get their mouth on it, they'll eat it. But they're carnivores, so it's got to be a living animal. And if it fits in their mouth, they love it. So ticks, mosquitoes, flies, slugs. American bullfrogs can eat California red-legged frogs, garter snakes, bats.
Wow.
So frogs are really neat, but they're having a lot of trouble around the world. 2,000 amphibian species are threatened with extinction. What threatened with extinction means is that if nothing's done to protect those species, and remove the threats, then we can expect them to go completely extinct in the near future. So it's about a third of all amphibian species are threatened. And relative to other groups, it's about 1/8 of birds are threatened and 1/4 of mammals. So that's not good either, but amphibians are even worse off, perhaps the most threatened group of animals on the planet. And in the last 30 or so years, about 200 species have gone completely extinct. Extinction is a natural process. All species eventually go extinct. But from the fossil record, the best we can tell, amphibians naturally go extinct about 1 species every 500 years. So right now they're disappearing several thousand times faster than they should be, which says something's clearly wrong in the environment that needs to get fixed. 6 main reasons that amphibians are having trouble around the world. Perhaps the biggest problem around the world, and especially in lowland areas, is habitat destruction. In developed countries, we've got urban expansion, suburbs moving outward, swamps being drained, put parking lots down, housing developments, malls, etc. And in developing countries, there's a big economic push to chop down, say, the rainforest. A lot of these tropical countries have very high amphibian biodiversity, which means there's a lot of different amphibian species there in the rainforest, but they're getting chopped down for timber, cattle ranching, sugarcane, oil palm plantations. And the lowland frogs have a lot of trouble because most of the human population lives in the lowlands. We like flat places, we like the ocean. It's hard to live on hills. And then also, the national parks, places we tend to protect, tend to be up in the mountains because it looks nice up in the mountains. So we've got a lot of people down low and proportionally not a lot of protected land. So here's another barred frog, the giant barred frog, second largest frog in Australia. He's got gold on top of his eyes. And they have a problem because they live in the lowlands, and it's primarily private land for cattle ranching, and they live right in the riparian area around the streams, and cattle damage the vegetation around the streams. So I was in Korea in November and saw several instances of habitat destruction. And so this is at the Nakdong River. The government just built a very large dam upstream from there. And this is a little preserve right here with a lot of narrowmouth frogs, which are having trouble. And the government wants to fix up, they say, the sides of the streams, and basically they're going to put about half of this park underwater, and there goes all those frogs. Han River is basically right in Seoul Central. Seoul's got about 22 million people, and this is a reserve that's had about 10 years worth of habitat restoration going on, and there's a large highway that runs right beside it. The Olympics are coming to Seoul, and the government plans within the next year to put a highway right on top of these wetlands. Here's a rice paddy, and in the rainy season, all the narrowmouth frogs come out, but the government wants to put an education building, a very large one, right on top of all that. So these are the kind of things, this goes on all around the world and usually just doesn't get much notice. At least in Korea, I'll talk a little about, there's people working to protect some of those sites. Over-harvesting for the pet and food trades is a big problem. Pet trade, especially for brightly colored species, because most people who want a pet like brightly colored species. Most of those brightly colored species live in tropical countries. People there don't have a lot of options for jobs. They can go out to the forest, catch a frog, sell it to a distributor, make a couple dollars, and then the frog gets shipped off to Japan, America, Europe. So blue poison dart frogs, strawberry poison dart frogs, in trouble because people like to collect them. Frog leg trades, oh yeah, so pet trade, about a few million wild caught frogs get imported into the US each year. So those are the legal ones, the ones we know about. There's probably a lot more that come in illegally. But the frog leg trade is a much larger problem. At least 100 million frogs get taken out of the wild each year for use as food. These are from a market in Indonesia. Indonesia's probably the largest consumer and largest exporter of frogs in the world. France and Belgium are 1 and 2 for imports, and the USA for frog legs. And our frog leg consumption is on the rise and set to overtake France and Belgium sometime soon if nothing's done. Invasive species are a big problem, especially in California. In the high Sierras, the lakes there are naturally fish